Yeah, so those of you that couldn't hear on Zoom, sorry, just a welcome again to the session looking at just transitions in South Africa in particular, trying to get to the depth of transitions and the sort of real interactions. We've got some interesting panelists both online and in our audience here in Scotland. So I'm going to frame the discussion quickly. I did an earlier framing at the beginning of the day, looking at what just transition means in South Africa. But in this session, we want to look at the interaction between agriculture and mining and some of the key issues that come from the transitions that are happening in those sectors. And so I'm going to jump in and sort of talk you through some of the work that the NBI has done on transitions through these sectors. So the NBI has been doing a project with BUSA and BCG looking specifically at how you would decarbonize each sector of the economy. And we've looked at some of the major sectors of the economy. We've looked at mining, we've looked at agriculture, forestry, and land use, we've looked at power, we've looked at gas, we've looked at transport, and we continue to work through the other sectors in the economy. So just to give you a sense of how this work has been governed so that we can have a sense of its reliability, the work has been governed by 3 steering groups, one group of CEO champions who've helped lead the work and help guide its political relevance and some of the technical issues. We have a group, an advisory board that's made up of government, civil society, and labor who've helped guide how we think, in particular around the just transition components. And then we have a steering committee made up of government, of business experts who help us with the modeling and the data. The key magic happens, though, in a series of technical committees we have every 3 to 4 weeks that have experts from business, but from all ranges of society, from academia, civil society, and government that help assess our assumptions and our data and our process around how we come to conclusions and give us better data, better assumptions. And so each time we have these meetings, we get slightly better and slightly more certain of our outcomes. This is the group of CEO champions. For those of you who are South African, this is a group that comprises many of our heavy emitters, certainly the biggest emitters in the economy being Eskom and Sasol. And there are people in the coal value chain, for example, Exxaro, but a huge range of other players, including from petrochemicals, from finance sector, from transport and logistics, from retail, and from law. So the key context in South Africa around transition risk and probably what made a big difference in how we understand transitions in South Africa is the role of sort of trade patterns and the fact that countries around the world that are making commitments, so for example here at COP, to decarbonize will change the commodities that they procure and therefore the commodities that we can sell into international markets. And you can see the bulk of our trading partners have made net zero commitments, and therefore this is a very real trade risk for us. First of all, with simple things like border tariff adjustments, the EU are planning to implement border tariff adjustments as early as 2023, but also in the commodities that are demanded of our major trading partners. And so you have the top 6 exports in South Africa are platinum group metals, gold, coal, iron ore, ferroalloys, and the internal combustion engine. And these are not things that will be in huge demand out to 2050, particularly as we transition away from coal and energy, but a third of platinum group demand comes from the internal combustion engine. So our first, second, and sixth exports are all vulnerable to these changes, whereas iron ore, gold, and ferroalloys are dependent on us providing net zero technologies. And certainly our sessions earlier in the day looking at hydrogen have been a part of that discussion. But they also require really zero cost energy inputs in order to be competitive. But this is a real challenge for the transition of the economy because the things we export kind of dominate our balance of payments. If we're not able to earn this foreign currency, we're not able to manage debt. Debt in South Africa is a big deal. We are now over 80% debt to GDP ratio post-COVID. And so if we aren't able to earn these incomes, we can't manage our debt, we get credit rated, downgraded, borrowing becomes more expensive, investment becomes more difficult, and we get into potentially a vicious negative cycle. So how do we flip that cycle into opportunity is a big part of what this discussion is about. And so we find ourselves at this hub of we need to have strong mitigation pathways to net zero. We have to acknowledge the impacts of climate change and the sort of adaptation risks that that imposes. And in the South African and global context, have to understand just transition and make sure that we do this in a way that transitions people out of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. So the key issues we have to make now will impact our competitiveness in 2050. So we like to say that the just transition conversation is not a 2050 conversation, it's a 2021, 2022 conversation, because we have to make investments that don't lock us into assets that hinder competitiveness in the long term. We have to recognize these changes in value pools and how we transition to take advantage of those value pools. And then in the context of just transition, we have to find sources of finance that help us transition and that provide some concessional funding, particularly in areas that we may need it, like hydrogen. So to kick off the conversation with the panels, I'm going to run through the findings of two key sectors, as I mentioned at the beginning, decarbonizing mining, but also decarbonizing agriculture. Mining is a huge contributor to South Africa's economy. It provides about 4% of direct jobs and 8% of GDP. And what's important also is the location of those jobs. So that although there may be 4% of jobs overall, these jobs are in critical locations, often rural locations where there aren't many other employment opportunities. Coal and platinum group mining within the total revenues provide about 50% of both jobs and revenues. And if we start to think about the direct jobs that mining creates, there is a huge amount of people that are supported through the mining value chain. Typically, a mining job is supporting somewhere between 17 and 13 dependents. So that's also an important characteristic. But in South Africa, mining has kind of undergone a structural decline over the last decade or so. So we've seen 10% drops in real production, 50,000 in total direct employment down, and a 43% decline in capex. And climate change is kind of worsening that situation. So I talked about these sort of commodity demand changes over time. There's obviously pressure to decarbonize from investors and from others, and the need to adapt to climate change. So as with all of our studies, the key questions we were trying to answer to get to grips to what these just transitions look like and the timing of them is what's happening in these commodity demands, how does the mining sector respond to its own decarbonization in order to access these markets, what just transition and social issues are emerging, and then what are the sort of technical pathways down to net zero. And really, at a high level, what you end up with is commodities that are at risk and commodities that have high value for South Africa. And we kind of plotted this out. And you can see things like thermal coal and palladium are at high risk. Things like iron ore, platinum, gold, we expect may grow. A lot of, in the platinum space, a lot of that depends on what happens with hydrogen and fuel cells. But things like manganese, chrome, and copper are also set to grow. And so there's an opportunity here in South Africa to convert the things that are in risk by increasing investment in other areas, increasing opportunity, and perhaps growing the mining sector as we transition. I have mentioned that most of the jobs and GDP contribution are coming from coal and the platinum group metals. And what's interesting about that is the spatial distribution. And you can see that in platinum group metals, most of the job impacts happening in the northwest of the country, whereas in the coal sector, most of that job impact is happening in Mpumalanga, one of the provinces in South Africa. And so you have this very place-based impact, even though there's a national impact and concern at the same time. And so when we start to talk about people getting left behind and the just transition impacts, it's understanding how these job losses impact particular communities where there may not be other opportunities. So apart from those kind of high-level views, in order to decarbonize the sector, I guess there are three critical levers that need to be pulled. One is to think about electricity supply. The majority of mining emissions are coming from electricity supply, particularly from Eskom. And so if we're able to decarbonize that electricity supply, that's about 77% of the emissions of the sector. The remaining emissions are controlled through sort of diesel and coal combustion, both in stationary combustion, but also in vehicles. And so the two key problems there, obviously, on-demand renewable energy for those mines, but then also to be able to use hydrogen and battery electric vehicles. And there's some really interesting innovations by South African companies to do that. And then the last little bit of the emissions comes from fugitive emissions, particularly from coal, but a little bit from gold. And those will basically phase out as we phase out those commodities. So it is a sector that can decarbonize. It's well within the range of opportunity. I'm not going to show you the rest of the slides in very much detail, but it gives you a sense of the timelines on when things need to be done in order to decarbonize the sector, and that is something that's very achievable. Obviously, adaptation impacts also critical to the mining sector. There are a lot of direct risks that are a real issue for them. Flooding of tailings dams, being able to pump water out of deep mines, being able to cool deeper, hotter mines. And so these also create an additional cost and put pressure on mining operations. The key issue, though, is can we take these opportunities for new investment? And the recent report that we released on decarbonizing the mining sector makes the point that we need to be investing about 8 billion rand a year just in exploration, trying to find out what are the other commodities that are there and how can we access them and get them into the markets. But how does that opportunity then translate into this broader definition of a just transition? So we're not just thinking about jobs and reskilling, as important as those things are. We're also thinking about social welfare. We're thinking about migrant communities, particularly in the context of mining. We're thinking about economic inclusion. So South Africa has over 50% of our youth are unemployed. And so we need to do these transitions in a way that include women and that include the youth in particular. Ownership is a key issue, as a key driver of inequality in South Africa. And so how do we structure these transitions in a way that also transitions ownership? And then there's a whole range of issues around quality of work, but also delivery of services for local communities. In many cases, the coal mining companies are working with local governments in order to provide services like wastewater treatment and water treatment in general. So to give a sense of the sort of types of investment that are required, we need about 380 billion rand in capital investment. We need to do that to help deploy hydrogen and other sort of remote grid services. We need to do that to do battery and fuel cell electric vehicle switching on site. And there's obviously a lot of uncertainty in this. But we think that if we can combine the right kind of policy frameworks and financial support, including some concessionary support, this is something that's completely achievable. So that's the mining context. One of the things that we talk about often in South Africa is those people that are losing jobs in mining are able to gain jobs in agriculture. And there are certainly some innovative studies, and Mongezi Veti from Exara is with us on the panel today, and we'll talk about some of their thinking around agriculture as well. But the sort of counterpoint to that, the challenge that you hear from Labour is how do you balance the same quality of job? So if you're losing a job in a mine, this is actually a very highly paid, highly skilled job, and transitioning potentially to a job in agriculture that isn't as highly paid and certainly isn't as highly skilled. And so these job swaps are not like for like, and that adds another sort of layer of complexity to the sector. So in agriculture, we asked similar kinds of questions. How do we understand changes in demand and supply? And obviously a key driver there is climate change itself. And so if you look at South Africa's sort of distribution of biodiversity at the moment, the chart on the far left there, you can see, although quite a lot of semi-desert and arid environments, also quite a lot of grasslands and wetlands and tropical environments. But as you go, as temperature increases, and it's interesting to note that South Africa heats at twice the rate of the global average. So a 2-degree increase globally means a 4-degree increase in South Africa. You can see the penetration of these arid environments into what now is our water provision and agriculture center of the country. So this first picture in the middle here is sort of a 2-degree scenario for South Africa globally. So even at 2 degrees, and we're, as you know, headed to something far higher than that, and you lose a lot of agriculture and water provision space. And this little strip of green that runs along here is where a lot of the water catchments are located. And so any massive increase in temperature then threatens water, which also has knock-on impacts on agricultural value chains. The 3-degree scenario, which is unfortunately the one that we are basically heading towards on current commitments, means that you will have massive drying of the country and far lower agricultural outputs. What's interesting when you start looking at these agricultural impacts is for the first 30 years up to 2050, regardless of the scenario, there isn't a huge diversion in impacts. But once you go beyond 2050, you get this massive divergence between your 3-degree and your 1.5-degree and 2-degree scenarios. And so the actions we take now may not have massive impacts in the next 10 to 20 years, but if you go beyond 2050 out towards 2100, then you really start to see the impacts. And of course, those impacts are irreversible. So we need to really understand them and make sure that we take the right mitigation actions now. If you look at the kinds of crops that South Africa produce and the sort of size of the bubbles there shows their level of employment, and the vertical axis shows the amount of revenue earned from those commodities, you can see that many of the traditional commodities in South Africa, like poultry and cattle, are extremely vulnerable. But then things like deciduous fruit, also extremely vulnerable. And these are driving sort of the high value exports in our economy, and therefore also contributing significantly. But there aren't many commodities that are not vulnerable to these kinds of climate changes. And so what we face is a balance of payments challenge as well, is that you're losing local production. You need to import those foods in order to meet nutrition and local dietary requirements, as well as just feeding people to base level. And so that costs you more money, and you may not, as a country, be able to afford that. So these are very significant risks. Decarbonizing the sector, and most of the sector emissions come from meat consumption. And I have to admit a secret hope that when we ran the study that we would find that for South Africa it would be different. We could not give up meat, but unfortunately it turns out that we do. And so this is the single biggest lever. Dietary change and not eating meat is the biggest lever to reducing emissions. That has just transition implications for South Africa and for Africa, because meat is very important to local culture, and people measure wealth by cattle. You can't get married without cattle. And so these are important cultural components and things that will be difficult for us to transition out of. I remember a couple of COPs ago commenting that South Africa will give up coal before we give up meat. And unfortunately, it turns out we have to give up both. So this is kind of the challenge. So that's the primary thing. There are other couple of key levers that we have to pull. Obviously, better crop selection is key, and better irrigation is key. And then there are things that are a little bit more sophisticated around sustainable agricultural practices. And then with a heavy link to the chemical sector, we also have to be able to produce carbon neutral fertilizers. And for that, we need to work with the chemical sector. So we have a range of interventions. Obviously, we don't have time to talk about this now. We invite you to download the reports that the MBI, BCG, and BUSA have done on decarbonizing each sector. But there's a whole range of sophisticated and very obvious things that we have to do to be able to decarbonize the sector. Again, something that is possible. And just to re-emphasize that the role of diets is unfortunately paramount. Investment also in significantly high numbers. So we've got 670 billion just needed on irrigation infrastructure in order to transition the sector, but a lot more that needs exploration. This is the chart that I did show earlier, but I wanted to re-emphasize again. South African households in South Africa spend about 1,000 Rand a month on food. And in order to have a nutritious diet, you need to spend 3,000 Rand a month on food, right? A carbon appropriate and nutritious diet will cost 4,300 Rand a month. And I think that paints the story of the just transition really well. 2/3 of the problem are around structural issues around poverty, inequality, and unemployment, and 1/3 of the problem is about climate change. But you can't solve those two independently. You kind of have to solve them together, and that is kind of what we're here to start talking about today. But this idea that we have to get people to 2,000, 3,000 Rand a month just for them to have a nutritious diet is kind of a shocking realization. So again, I'm going to jump through some of these slides. Just want to thank some of the funders that have helped support this work. UK Pact with the Women Business Coalition, the EU SPEPA Fund, as well as the Africa Climate Foundation have all supported this project in various ways. And hopefully this is a useful basis for us to start talking about the just transition. And for those of you in the audience and online, we also welcome you to think to go onto our web hub. So we have an online hub that these reports are available. We have reports for the power sector. We also have reports for the mining, for agriculture, forestry, land use, for gas, and for the petrochemical sector. And we'll be adding some reports as we go along. But also, hopefully this will be a useful place for you to learn about South Africa and our decarbonization journey. So that was a quick kind of overview. Just wanted to give people, especially those of you who are not from South Africa, a sense of what this transition challenge might look like. And I'm going to introduce a really excellent panel who are going to help us think through some of these just transition challenges. And I tried to introduce as we went along how these systemic changes that often are exogenous, they're happening to us because of what's happening in the rest of the world, affect people. And how we talk about this is really important. So on the panel today, we've got Mr. Salim Fakir, who's the Executive Director of the African Climate Foundation. We've got Mr. Mongezi Veti, who's the Executive Head of Sustainability at Exaro, and I've mentioned some of the Exaro work already. Online, we have Mr. Nkisi Lesufi, who's a Senior Executive of Environment, Health, and Legacies at the Mineral Councils for South Africa, and Fazal Musa, who's the Divisional Executive for Industry Planning and Project Development at the IDC. And so I'm going to ask each of the presenters, and unfortunately Salim can only be with us until about 2 o'clock. So I'm going to kick off with Salim, but I'm going to ask each person to spend 5 minutes or so just reflecting on mining and agriculture and just transitions and what we need to do, but in particular focusing on how we integrate people into this conversation. So Salim, I'll give you the floor. You should have a microphone there on the table. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. I just want to thank you, Steve and MBI, for inviting me to just make a few remarks. I know people are probably tired already. Copy fight. So I'll just raise a few points. I think generally, the conversation on just transition is can be very narrow. It's very focused on the electricity sector. I think what you've presented is a broader landscape of where this issue will be relevant, particularly in the agricultural sector. I know people want to start taxing meat. I don't think that'll go down very well in Africa to tax meat. We all love our nyama. Yeah. Nyama. I think that's the one issue. The other is that there are other sectors, obviously, that we have to look at. But I thought I'll raise a couple of points for us to think about. I don't think this is just a carbon issue that we have to think about. This is a broader concept around human security that encompasses security around electricity or energy. The second part is around economic security, the sovereignty of South Africa's economy. And the other is around worker and community security in the areas that are largely going to be affected. So the world wants decarbonization and security from over-carbonization. We have to think about this in a setting of security in a more broader sense of the word. The second part is that decarbonization also involves investment in effectively modernization of the global economy. That's ultimately what it's all about. Our modernization has occurred around, effectively around a coal, iron, and steel and minerals complex. And the new economy has to be around basically service economy, enable environment of digitization, new kinds of industrial development, and if not, a new minerals energy complex that you just put out some of the new kinds of minerals that will become vital to the green economy. And we haven't thought about this just transition in terms of shifting to a new kind of modernized economy and a new minerals energy complex with a very different energy mix in the system. The third is that global decarbonization, and if the IEA report does become reality, if we don't risk our highly intense carbon sectors, we pose a sovereign risk to South Africa's economy. And as you know, even SARB, the South African Reserve Bank, is looking at this closely. They have a whole research program on monetary policy and financial risk and managing this risk systemically across the economy. The fourth is decarbonization. Expansion of decarbonization involves new kinds of technology and the scale of the technology. And often South Africa is a latecomer, late adopter of technology. I think that's okay. Once everywhere else, richer countries, advanced countries have solved the cost barriers and the scale issue, we can take on the adoption of it, and we can also, on the basis of scale, industrialize. I know Faisal, when he speaks, when he comes on, he will talk about the importance of electrolyzers and so on, and South Africa's ability to capture at least a considerable amount of that value chain is going to be important. Fifth, we're investing in new infrastructure, new kinds of enterprises, new types of companies. These are effectively new kinds of investments and assets in the South African economy. And they would play an important role going forward. But to get to this entire approach, we've got to definitely move beyond just the focus on the electricity sector. We have to have a unified position between business, labor, civil society, government, that this becomes a broader whole economy issue. And electricity is just one aspect, but a very critical one. You solve the electricity problem from a security point of view, but also you decarbonize it, you effectively contribute to de-risking the broader economy. But then you have to integrate all these other elements that I mentioned. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, some really good points that I'd like to pick up again a little bit later. But maybe just to ask you a follow-up question, do you think that conversation in South Africa about non-power related transitions is happening, and where is that happening?
It's on the margins. It's not happening. I think your work that you're doing with BCG is going to be vital to bring it to the fore. I think the Presidential Commission has a vital role to play to that. When they do their decarbonized pathways, they will have to look at this more. But I think we must not look at it just simply as a technology issue, but a economic transformation issue with many of the other elements of inclusivity, the redistribution of wealth, job creation, etc. Decarbonizing with the current structure of the economy is not going to help anybody, and we have to take a more broader view. So I would say that it's still on the margins, it's not there, and I think this is a nice initiative for NBI to focus on.
Kick off, yeah, thank you. Mongezi, can I ask you to give your opening view?
Steve, can you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you, CEO. Steve, I'll start by saying thank you very much for the introduction and the kind words that you have mentioned earlier on about Exxaro. I'll start my story, Exxaro story, back in 2009, when this concept of climate change and renewables started in the organization. And why I'm telling you this is because I just want to put perspectives on where we come from as the organization and the number of years of transition and tough conversations within the organization up to this point. And we have also been a partner in terms of relationship with this conference, COP, and we became part of this COP since 2011 in COP 17 in Durban in 2011. And we've been part of these conversations and playing critical role over the years. And this has helped us to shape the journey and the direction of the organization that we lead as the executive. And then we later then thought of converting all these signals that we see coming into the horizon into practicable strategies in the company. And there came the projects relating to the first wind project that we embarked on during the IPP second window in South Africa, which we took an opportunity and advantage of and became part of a partnership between Tata and us on a 50-50 split. And that spelled the beginning of Exxaro getting into renewables. And later in the years, then we acquired the, in 2019 to be specific, the other 50% to make it 100%. And in that transition, then we thought that it cannot happen on its own without a specific emphasis on sustainable growth and impact, and the concept of just transition. And those two, we use them interchangeably in the organization because we see them as twins. And there later came the issue of ESG and also TCFDs. And why we participate in those, it is in this quest that we have as the organization, perhaps to see far ahead of what could possibly happen, because we want to protect our sustainability and our existence. And later in the journey, we decided to commence with a enterprise supplier development fund, which then helps to put action into the words in terms of just transition. And this started in 2018. In 2018, we put up a committee and we invited small enterprises in South Africa who came and present their businesses. And some of them, we even started them from the beginning. And this process was immersed in the belief that in order for us to drive just transition, we need to ensure that we don't leave anyone behind. And people from various sectors in the small medium enterprises came to Exxaro and made presentations about their own organizations and how we can help them to improve themselves. That program made a positive contribution to the employment in South Africa, which we think is one chronic challenge that the country is facing. To this point, we have, through that program, we have helped employment numbers to surge to in excess of 4,000 employees. And these are numbers of jobs that at the baseline, when the people or these entrepreneurs came to us, did not have. And through our efforts, we help them to put those jobs, and they are sustainable going forward. To this day, we have also managed to let them advise us of their development journey in terms of improving the value of their own businesses. If we aggregate their businesses from their baseline, that is in excess of about 1.5 billion rand of the impact that we have made in small, medium enterprises in the country. And here at COP, in every session or event, we talk about just transition. But I think we need to move a little bit more in just talking about it, but and accompany that with tangible actions. And I think Exxaro is standing in a position to invite a number of organizations, even those that are led by government, to a certain extent, to embark on that. Let me also share with you that our funding is based on zero interest percent and grants. Why we do that? Because we've realized that it is extremely difficult for small, medium enterprises in the country to access funds in the normal, conventional financial sector. And we have encouraged people to take advantage of that opportunity, and it seems to be working. And we invite others to join us in the country, just to make sure that we are not doing this alone. And because we are now inundated by a number of applications, and of course we need them, but we just think that it is important for other corporate citizens in the country to go along with us. And then if I just want to also move on the question of ESG. If you look at the ratings of FTSE Russell, Exxaro is performing extremely well in its own category of coal mining companies in the globe. In actual fact, we were in the top 3 the very first year we participated in it, and we need that rate. We lead that rating just because of our contribution to society. And I won't go individual projects, but we have got tangible projects in agriculture. You mentioned earlier on, Steve, maybe about for me to say something about what we do in agriculture. Because of the fact that we are in mining, it became evident to us that mining is a finite business or finite minerals. At some point, we will cease to exist as a business if we only stay in mining. And therefore, if you want to make an impact in the process of transitioning from coal to energy, then you got to create what we call parallel economy sector in agriculture. We have taken advantage of the vast tracts of land that we own alongside the other mining houses in South Africa that are owning the same or even more land. But we thought that if we take advantage of that and try to repurpose land to empower communities and organize them into enterprises that they own. And in your earlier remarks, Steve, you mentioned that as we transition, the jobs between mining and coal, mining and agriculture, as we transition them, is not like for like. And it is true, but in agriculture, we encourage them to be owners. In mining, they were employees. So the opportunity in this case is that they become owners of agricultural businesses that we work together with them, and they own them, and they work in those projects so that they can feel what it is to be an owner of a business, because there's huge difference between being just an employee and owner of a business. And we're taking them through that process, and it seems to be working extremely well. With that, I will pause. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think Exxaro is a really interesting case study, and certainly something that we at MBI have learned quite a lot from the process Exxaro have been running over the last couple of years. And there's three things that I want to highlight. One is this is how you would want a heavy emitter to behave in the market, right? To understand the finiteness of their resource and their operation, to be thinking about new strategies, and certainly Exxaro leading in that kind of thinking. But also this idea that you need innovation and scaling to create local jobs, and some of the programs that have looked to aggregate different projects together to create a net impact across a range of projects, as opposing to thinking about one project as key. And then also the assumption that you need to work with others, and I love this interaction that you point about between mining and agriculture, and that you transition people from being employees to owners. I mean, that's really interesting and really important in the narrative of a just transition in South Africa, because we have this ownership inequality, this massive inequality between who has capital and who doesn't. And so I think that these are all really interesting things. We'll come back to some of this discussion a little bit later. So I'm going to ask Mr. Lesufi back in Johannesburg, I think, to talk a little bit about these just transition ideas, but from the perspective of the mining sector at the Minerals Council for South Africa. So thank you, Mr. Lesufi, over to you.
Thank you, Steve. Good afternoon, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I just wish to apologize in advance. We have been load shared, so I've tried to use my backup to put the video on and my Wi-Fi router on. If we encounter any problems, I will probably switch off my video and start and speaking of video, if it's okay with you, Steve.
That's good, thank you. We can see you perfectly so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think the concept of a just transition, I think, has been socialized within the Minerals Council. And I think we probably have to stay away from the philosophical and ideological stances that may have been expressed here and there, but look at the pragmatic and possible opportunities that, Steve, you have outlined in terms of the threats and opportunities that are facing and challenges that are facing the mining industry. As we would expect, in the Minerals Council, we've got, we are a multi-commodity. Should I continue, Steve?
Yeah, sorry, it's a little bit like being in an airport here. Occasionally you get these announcements coming over the, so it should be over in a second or so.
Okay,
there we go.
No worries. No worries. I was just explaining that we are a multi-commodity organization, therefore we are being pulled in different directions, but we still have got the responsibility to ensure that the center hold and provide a well-considered view in terms of the next steps in the just energy transition. Now, as you would know, from our perspective, we have the building blocks of what a just transition should look like. However, there are limitations in terms of the lessons that we have and the experiences that we have so far. So there are great opportunities for learning and taking up new issues. If I could go to basics first, I think as a mining industry, and Mongezi has already alluded to that we've got a legal obligation in terms of ensuring that the communities and the mine workers who work in our facilities should be left better off than when we find them. They should be better off when we live and when we find mechanisms of leaving those areas. So it's a very important consideration that we have always been having to juggle with and try to perfect. But there are a couple of challenges that I will share with you. But first, on a generic basis, we've got, I'm almost going to sound schizophrenic, as I've explained, that we've got commodities that seize opportunities in the decarbonization journey, and we've got commodities that seize existential threat in the decarbonization journey. And therefore, we at the Minerals Council are in a position where we are required to square that circle. We also see an energy diversification opportunity because, as you know, we are energy deficit in South Africa, and therefore the concept of self-generation, particularly with renewables, present itself as a unique opportunity for the mining industry to win itself of the coal energy supply. But we also have a problem with the integrated nature of what the just transition requires. If I give the example of the mining industry as it is now, we've got what we call a mine closure strategy. And that mine closure strategy basically dictated that you should close the mine in a manner such that there's environmental sustainability and social economic sustainability. And we have had opportunities in terms of doing that. But we think the just transition is a much more bigger scale in terms of the requirement to leave the communities in a much more economically secure situation than when we found them. And the challenges are the following. In terms of closure, there was always a planned closure. We always knew that the mine was going to be for 30 years, and we could plan our processes in terms of the revenue that we generate, the obligations that we have, so that everybody derives benefits from our presence in the area. But in terms of the transition due to decarbonization, the challenges are much bigger. They are bigger in the following way, that the pace that is required is much faster. So we need to be agile in terms of trying to decarbonize and also maintain an element of social and economic stability. The scope is much bigger because when we do mine closure, the focus was much more on leaving environmental sustainability in place, ensuring that the workers are well looked after, etc., etc. But in this instance, there's supposed to be cross-sectoral collaboration because of the value chain of the sector, that you cannot close the coal mining industry in one soup and be able to put in remedial measures as feasible as that may sound. So it is a big challenge. So what have we as the Minerals Council have done in terms of trying to reconcile those extreme positions in our sector, where we've got those who see economic opportunities, and we've also got those who see existential threats? Now, we have engaged our members broadly. So the following ideas and processes are underway. We are enhancing our exploration activities, and we are trying to remove the bottlenecks in terms of exploration of the minerals that are essential for a transition to a low carbon economy. We are ensuring that each and every one of our members at least has got in place a process or a plan in which he can outline that in terms of 2030 to 2050, what are the plans for the scope 2 emissions in terms of mitigation, and what are the scope in terms of what are the plans in terms of scope 3 elimination. Now, the challenge that we are having here is that in terms of the desktop information that we've received so far, it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach. We are not going to be able to decarbonize at the same pace. There are fast movers who are able to do this transition much faster, particularly the newer mines who are having opportunities to plan properly and actually to almost have a transition in mind even before they start their operations. So we are going to be faster in that space. We also have got a group of mines which are the much more mature mines, which have to retrofit and adapt, and that was going to take a bit of time. So in terms of the information, we are going to have a bit of a phased approach. We're not going to have a big bang approach. I think that's an important point to ponder. But lastly, we're also going to have those that are intractable. And for those who have not yet come to maybe a landing, if I may call it internally, and there's still some haggling that is taking place within ourselves in terms of how to deal with those mines that are unable to provide a proper plan in terms of a transition to a low carbon economy. So I think from our side, what you will have at the end of our processes towards the end of this year is probably a roadmap where you can have a gallery, a workbook of the different mining operations in terms of the plans of their transition and the possible targets that they are going to achieve, and also a plan in terms of the laggards, how those laggards need to be assisted to go over the line. I think I'll stop there to get more questions if necessary. Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I'm very interested in this idea that even within the sector, you've got a varying degrees of maturity and varying degrees of access to options to be able to mitigate earlier or later, very much like you have at a country level, what we're talking about at these negotiations. And I guess domestically, that then becomes quite a challenging conversation, particularly in relation to access to capital in international markets. But we'll pick that up again just now. So I'm then going to ask Mr. Fazal Musa from the IDC. If you're online, there you go. Great, thank you. Yeah, I know you missed the beginning of the conversation. Just to recap, but we talked about how sectors need to both decarbonize their emissions in order to be competitive, but need to work with others. And most of the panelists have kind of raised that as well, to innovate on new things, to find new things to invest in and new ways to strengthen the South African economy. And I guess the IDC in particular is well positioned to talk about that in terms of investing in the new. And perhaps you can also reflect on the sort of social just transition complexities that come with that, particularly in the South African context.
Great, thank you, Steve, and good to meet everybody virtually. We're also suffering from load shedding where I am, so please bear with me if there are issues in that regard. Maybe I'll start with just a little bit of history on what the IDC has funded to date with respect to transitioning from a fossil fuel-based economy to renewables. We've done about 15 billion rands of funding of renewables in rounds 1 to 4 of the renewable program. In this most recent round, I think we are in 21 out of 25 projects, if I remember correctly, and have of the order of 3.5 billion rand of exposure planned there. But that's almost sort of low-hanging fruit when we look at the scale of and the breadth of the tasks at hand. I think this notion of what is the just transition and how do we attend to it needs to be quite seriously considered, and it needs to be considered from a bankability and a feasibility perspective. We are doing quite a bit on our side to look at ways in which we can almost repurpose the 80,000 jobs that are there in the coal sector currently, that theoretically will be removed by the removal of coal-fired generation. We know it's a gradual process, and there's going to be a drop-off in line with the integrated resource program. However, every coal-fired power plant that comes offline and is not appropriately repurposed, creates a massive loss of jobs in those regions. And those regions are not the typical renewable energy regions that we're familiar with in South Africa, which then leads us to the minerals beneficiation and looking at the new minerals complexes that lead into the renewable sector. And we've done quite a bit there. We've probably invested in the region of about 800 million rand to date across a variety of initiatives linked to the new economy or the new renewables economy. So we've got investments in early stage developments in vanadium flow batteries, in cobalt oxide batteries, in battery electric vehicle manufacturing, and even in things like green ship recycling. So we're looking at quite a bit, both in terms of energy efficiency, in terms of taking existing industry and trying to look at ways in which we can make it greener. And then also quite substantially looking at the new minerals complex that emerges from the new direction that the world is taking with respect to carbon emissions. Mention one or two other things. We're looking at what we call mine to magnets. So magnets are obviously used in electric vehicles, and we're looking at the minerals that we'd be able to mine in order to produce these magnets locally. So I think that gives you a general sense of the area we're looking at and the areas we are looking at. The only thing I'd like to add is that we need to ensure that the proposals we come up with and the initiatives that we all engage in are properly thought through from a bankability perspective. Because at the end of the day, there are many financiers who will be willing to support this, but projects need to be structured in a way that allow the financing to make these projects materialize. I think that would be the sum of my input. I hope that was worthwhile, Steve.
Yeah, very helpful. Thanks. We'll certainly have some follow-on questions. So a couple of things that I picked up from across the conversations that I want to ask, but I first want to just check if there's anyone in the audience or online who want to ask questions of the panelists. Anyone here in the audience, raise your hand if you have a actual physical hand. It'll be a new experience for a lot of people who've been online for so long. If you do have a question, can you come up quickly, and you'll have to use the mic here and ask it. Appreciate that. So we've got one person coming up with a question quickly.
Yeah, if you could just clarify if the agricultural economic development that you're doing is for miners who are losing their job or for communities who happen to live on those lands. I was just curious about the openness to moving in that direction.
Great, thanks. Go ahead.
Thank you for that question. I'll say the program that we have caters just about for everyone in South Africa. But then the projects will spread across. Some of them are former employees of the mining industry, as you request or asks. And especially in the area of the previously large labor sending areas in the Eastern Cape, one of our provinces in South Africa. And then in Mpumalanga is also the individuals who find themselves losing their jobs through the process of transitioning. They've also come to us, and we have long time lists with them, just sort of 10 years using our own land, and they've got thriving agricultural businesses on those lands of ours. Thanks.
I mean, maybe just a follow-up question to that. How easy if you see, you can come in on this as well. How transferable is the skill set from one kind of mining to another? So does a coal miner transition easily to platinum or gold, or is that a very difficult transition? And so as we talk about things like minerals beneficiation and other minerals, are the people employed in existing coal and gold and other sectors that may be under threat? Is it easy for them to move, or how would that happen?
Contrary to the popular belief that it would be difficult to transition from mining to agriculture, it just so happened that almost everyone, or 80 to 90% of people who worked on the mines grew up in agriculture in whatever part of the country that they were born. They tend to be rural based, and that gives them the advantage of quick transition across. So where they found challenges is large scale equipment, which in some areas we have helped them to source from the neighboring farmers in terms of hiring them during the season to conduct the activities. But in general, in terms of looking after the crops, etc., they fit extremely well.
Okay. I mean, maybe Nikisi, you can also answer the.
Yeah, I think in terms of skills transferability, as I've indicated, we were doing the narrow version of the just transition, in the sense that for us, mine closure or body depletion, mechanization system were always a threat to job security, in the sense that if we use a mechanized system, people are going to lose jobs. So we needed to put in place remedial measures in terms of the skills improvement of the workers to be able to engage in other economic sectors other than mining. Therefore, the transferability, we've got a program of what we call Mining Skills 4.0 that identifies skills of the future that the mines were going to need in terms of a mechanized system and digitalization of the mining industry. We have a system of what we call advanced ore body knowledge systems, where almost the earth becomes a glass, and we are able to identify the ore body of interest, and therefore we are in a position to extract that ore body in a manner that is friendly to the environment and does not expose workers to hazardous conditions. So we have been having those challenges of how do we reskill our workers for the future, and we have a program to deal with that. But I think the program needs to be expanded now that we've got the broader decarbonization agenda in play, no longer only the ore body depletion and the difficulty of mining, but the fact that the current crop of mine workers need to be reskilled in other forms of economy. If agriculture is one of them, we need to be able to put them in touch with the relevant skills upliftment programs to allow them to be able to do that. So it's part of that learning that I indicated earlier, that we look at the decarbonization journey as expanding on the little work that we've been doing across the board in terms of skills, in terms of how we manage land, in terms of how we manage people, etc. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, maybe just to double down on that question again, just about specifically retraining from one commodity to another. So, how easy it is to move to, if you're a coal miner, is it easy to get into platinum mining? Can you do vanadium mining? How much retraining would be required? Are we talking months, years? Mongezi?
Yeah, moving from one commodity to another requires a massive training program. First, even in the skilled area, because if you're coming from the coal mining, you're going to hard rock mining, then you've got to do conversion from certification point of view. But then it's even more challenging at the labor and at the coal face because of the different machinery that is employed in those different underground operations. So that a transition between commodities requires extreme skills upliftment. And I agree with Nick's on the screen on the other side that even in agriculture itself, there is basic training that is also provided by mining houses as the people are returning back home, either by means of retirement or other means. So that upskilling is really necessary.
I mean, I'll come to you now, Fazal, but I guess one of the questions I have, not only is the reskilling a challenge, but I imagine that the location is a challenge. So the platinum mines are not in the same place as the coal mines, which I imagine will not be in the same place as vanadium mines. So even if you could reskill, is it feasible to move people from one district, one province to another in order to have them with that job continuity, or is it something that you have to create localized job options for those people? And I invite either Mongezi or Nikisa to respond.
I think mostly it has to be a localized job replacement programs, because it's differentiated at the top echelons of the industry. I think mobility is quite easy. No, they can move from one sector to another, as Mongezi have explained. But at the lower level, particularly below the miner and the rock driller level, I think it becomes difficult to relocate them to other areas for new ventures. So the idea is then for them to look for economic succession in the areas where they were employed, rather than go to a different province.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that certainly requires quite a high level of, we get back to the innovation on investment. If you're going to create opportunities for people who are losing their jobs in the mining sector and other sectors, that requires quite a large amount of coordination across sectors. And then I guess there's this additional question, and maybe I'll come back to you, Fazal, around, is there a coordination mechanism for mining companies and development banks and commercial banks to start looking at what these opportunities are within each sector? That then helps us to understand what that investment needs to look like. And maybe a second part to that question is, what kind of international support is needed? So if we think about just transition, both locally and globally, what kind of support do you think is needed from international funders and policymakers in order for us to achieve this transition?
Well, maybe to answer the first question around industry interaction and coordination. We've actually got a whole unit that works across government, industry associations, and various private sector parties to put together what are called sectoral master plans. So we've currently got a number of master plans that are running either in process or completed. Furniture and textiles, steel industry, automotive industry, etc. And so there is a lot of coordination around how we move towards a green economy, both within all of those sectors, generally speaking, and then across sectors. So, for example, we've got a green hydrogen. We actually coordinate the green hydrogen interaction across South Africa and South African institutions on behalf of government. That is multifaceted, and it does involve interaction with all the private sector and governmental entities. One of the things we do look at is the geographical distribution of economic activity. And that's quite an important focus area for us. And we've actually got a special economic zones focus, with each economic zone focusing on the competitive and comparative advantage in those particular areas. In addition to that, a particular Northern Cape focus, because most of the SEZs in the country outside of the Northern Cape, actually all of them are. So I hope that answers the first question.
Maybe just a follow-up and before you jump
Sure.
into the next question. I mean, in your view, having been involved in some of these master planning processes, and I've been involved in a few on the fringes, how are they really taking climate and long-term climate pressures into account, or are they much shorter-term sort of economic recovery plans?
I think you've got to, I think theoretically, yes, they are. I think at the end of the day, the proof is in the pudding. And we've got to ask ourselves, are there actual initiatives that are materializing from it? We haven't done a scan of what everybody is doing in the industry. But from our perspective, a number of our project developments, which are initiatives that are targeted towards new sectors or new economic growth, where we do channel a substantial amount of capital and resources. So we have, experienced project development teams running on each initiative. In that regard, we've got quite a few running at the moment. And if that's an indication of whether both long-term planning is occurring and investment is occurring, then I would say yes.
Okay, great, thank you.
The second question was with respect to international support and participation. We're fortunate that we've had a lot of government-to-government or government agency-to-government agency interaction. And there's a lot of cooperation that's occurring at the moment targeted towards decarbonization, green industries, etc. I think what would be valuable is bringing the experience, the balance sheets, and the expertise of a number of multinationals who've been there and done that in various geographies globally, and allowing them to co-invest with South African entities locally. The other big focus we have is finding those areas in global value chains where we can actually have local production. So that's why we're looking at the Mine to Magnets initiative. We're looking at the vanadium flow batteries. And with respect to the hydrogen economy, we're probably going to end up looking at how we can get involved in electrolyzer production at scale. So, globally, there's a shortage of electrolyzers that would be required for the hydrogen economy aspirations that we all have. And South Africa and Zimbabwe, for that matter, are both very well located to have at least a significant amount of electrolyzer production or portions of it here, wherever we have a competitive or comparative advantage.
Yeah, that's really great. And from an IDC perspective, do you have mechanisms to stimulate social inclusion in these investment programs? I mean, how do you go about some of the more challenging components of a just transition? We've talked about skills and skills development and job creation, but how do you deal with things like gender inclusion or youth employability or even the trickiest of all, transfer of ownership?
When you say transfer of ownership, what are you referring to, Steve?
Well, sorry. So in the setup, we talked a little bit about how so much of the wealth is owned by such a small portion of the population, and that's a big contributor to ownership because capital growth exceeds often sort of earnings growth and wage growth. And so how do we solve that particular driver of inequality in the South African system?
Yeah, we've been very fortunate to have a number of financing products that actually address that. And, just in the past month in the agriculture sector, we've assisted a lot of medium-sized agribusiness producers move a step towards becoming large agribusiness producers. There's a number of products we have. One is we can actually warehouse equity on behalf of Black industrialists or communities or workers' trusts, etc., to be identified. Alternatively, we can actually fund these entities for equity participation in projects. We're also managing probably at the moment in the region of about 4 billion rands of grant and concessionary funding, particularly targeted towards job creation, small business support, SMEs, etc. So there is quite a wide range of funding mechanisms that are available and have been utilized. A lot of our exposure in this most recent round of the renewable program will be targeted towards supporting Black industrialists. So I don't think the issue is really whether or not the financing products are there or whether or not the capital is available. I think the issue is about whether or not we have the projects that are appropriately structured for bankability.
So maybe talk about that a little bit more. You know, that's obviously a constraint. You mentioned that a couple of times. Maybe just describe what you mean by projects being ready for bankability and what you think needs to be done for that. In particular, is there an additional challenge in getting bankable projects out of sort of smaller community-based or place-based operations? Like, how does that specifically relate to just transition?
So the issue from a financier's perspective around bankability is that whatever is being proposed must have been done before with proven technology at scale, right? When you're moving into a large scale initiative, if you're doing a pilot, then you can pilot new technology, but then it happens on a smaller scale. When we're talking about just transition, we're talking about, you know, in totality, 80,000 jobs. You're talking about a massive piece of the economy. Then we've got to talk about technology and project structures that we know will work if we fund them. So to use an example, when round one of the renewable program came about, a 75 megawatt PV plant was considered amongst the largest in the world, and our program was full of them. Almost all the plants we did were 75 megawatts. All right. Now, a 75 megawatt PV plant is not considered very large. Why? Because the technology and the supply chain supporting it and the producers producing the equipment and the financing structures behind it and the insurance, etc., have all developed to the extent that we can actually have an economic sector around solar production. Now, if you compare that to, for example, green hydrogen, we're all still getting our heads around it. There's important pieces of the puzzle that we cannot implement right now. A simple example would be electrolyzers on a large scale. There are not very large electrolyzers in the world. Who are we going to get who will provide an electrolyzer at a large scale and guarantee it, and we'd be able to finance against it for 20 years? Because typically infrastructure finance involves long-term financing. So these are not challenges which, you know, cannot be overcome. All I'm saying is that we've got to look at it from the perspective of how we pull the finance on board so that these projects actually materialize.
Okay. Excellent. Again, I want to invite the audience to see if there are any questions, either in person or online. Any questions? Okay, no questions online. Okay, well then I think what I will do is I'll give each person 1 or 2 minutes just to wrap, and then you know, so I'll start with Mongezi and end with you, Fazal. So Mongezi, any last comments from your side?
Thank you, Steve. The point I'm going to raise now in closing is that at Exxaro, we are moving steadfast in our endeavor to
make sure that we create this positive impact to communities out there. And agriculture is what we think is part of the solution in addressing what we all call just transition. Just maybe to touch on what Faisal has mentioned earlier on with respect to projects that are bankable as they come to the funders. So in our case, we also found that being one of the biggest challenges, because the people we talk about or the entrepreneurs we're talking about are largely people who lack education and they lack resources. And we've just realized that you need to have patience in taking them from the beginning and provide what we call seed funding in terms of grants, so that you walk the journey with them from literally nothing into a bankable project with all the skills that we have to assist them to get to that point, so that when you get to bankability, then I can help them to get to ITC, land bank, etc. So that's our strategy. We knew that the people we're dealing with do not have resources, and at some point you really need to dig deep in terms of helping those people to make it work. And I'm overemphasizing this point because just transition is not going to be easy. It is going to cost money from all of us. And organizations must also be prepared to grant the money for the development in the transition of creating this equitable and sustainable energy revolution going forward. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Lots that I agree with there. Nikisi?
Thanks, Steve. I think in closing, I just wanted to indicate that as a Minerals Council, we have adopted a dual approach in terms of a bottoms up and top down, in the sense that I think we really believe that we can make a difference if each and every mining operation can have a decarbonization plan in place. And then we have then got the body of knowledge in terms of what the key challenges are and have what opportunities present themselves in terms of building up scale. Because if we don't do that, I think we simply talk about it. It will be talked about in the boardrooms, but it will not be happening operationally. So we do believe that if we go down to the operations and see the art of the possible at the operational level, then we'll be able to build up a good body of knowledge where the mining industry can then set the agenda in terms of how it can decarbonize on its own. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's an important point, and something we haven't really touched on is this idea of procedural justice. How do you involve a wide range of views and people in first of all, identifying what the right solutions are, but then also making sure that we include people. Fazal, I'm going to hand over to you to kind of close from the panel perspective, but there's also a quick question that popped up in the chat that perhaps you can address in your closing. In your previous comment, you talked about not introducing unnecessary risk into the system and this need to manage risk. And the question is really about how will we rely on innovative ways of operating and of financing, and how do we invest in the new, the out-of-the-box projects, considering the risk-averse nature of the sector? And then perhaps you can also then touch on your role as a DFI in the spectrum. Do you take more risk? How do you think about that? And then your closing comments. Thank you.
Thanks. I was just reading the question as prior to coming on. I think my statement is more about what you base a just transition strategy on. You can't base the entire strategy on new initiatives. You've got to base a strategy on a blend of some new initiatives and a lot of tried and tested bankable technologies. Does this mean that we're only going to run a whole lot of small pilots? No. There's a lot of grant concessionary and green targeted capital to even run very large pilots. And to use an example, in concentrated solar production, when they try to look at tower technology, each transaction was of the order of about 10 billion rands. And that was new solar technology. So there's nothing wrong with running pilots at scale. And there is capital available for it. There's also capital available to develop new financing structures. What I do have a problem with is that if you base your entire strategy around just transition on that aspect of technology and financing and development, we cannot just throw out, all the years of experience in terms of risk mitigation, risk management, etc., on the basis that because we're moving into a new sector, we are only going to take a subset of technologies forward.
Really interesting. Thanks. I mean, any other closing comments you might want to make?
I thought I'd use that as my closing comment.
Okay, yeah, that's good. Well segued. So I just want to thank all the panelists. I think it was a really interesting discussion. I guess what I have picked up from the various discussions we've had over the week and over today, specific focus on just transition, is this is incredibly complex. It's an incredibly systemic thing. You cannot solve this one node at a time. And we have to find these mechanisms that allow us to talk to each other, the finance sector, the individual sectors themselves, the projects within those sectors, the people involved in those sectors. It's a huge effort. And really needs to be the focus of how we drive this conversation forward in the future. And today, I think, was a good start. And we're going to have to pick these conversations up both locally and globally. So thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the audience here in Glasgow. And thank you to the audience online. And thank you for your questions. We appreciate that. Hope you have the wonderful rest of the day and rest of COP. And look forward to conversations in the future. Thanks very much.